And yet the Jews understood exactly what he was claiming for himself. Moving on. I'm going to skip over the next one because we're running out of time. I want to get to the Gospel of Barnabas. The Gospel of Barnabas, because this is a rather unique story. Gospel of Barnabas. What the Muslim arguments claim is, the Muslims claim that during the time of Christ, when the Bible, shortly after the death of Christ, when the Bible was being put together by the early church fathers, there existed at the time many, many different gospel accounts. And the early church fathers arbitrarily selected Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John to be the four gospels that were to be included in the New Testament, and by choice rejected the Gospel of Barnabas as part of the Bible. But the claim of Muslims is the Gospel of Barnabas was every much a legitimate gospel as the other four gospels. But Christians, the early church fathers, chose to reject it, chose not to include it in the Bible, but it should have been included according to the Muslim argument. It was written by an authoritative disciple of Christ by the name of Barnabas. So why has the Christian world hidden the Gospel of Barnabas? Now, the reason Muslims want to include the Gospel of Barnabas in the New Testament is because it actually substantiates some of their own claims. A moment ago, we talked about the claim of Jesus being predicted, or Muhammad being predicted by Jesus. The Gospel of Barnabas actually shows that Jesus, according to the Gospel of Barnabas, Jesus specifies Muhammad by name and talks about Muhammad by name. He names Muhammad as one to come after him. The Gospel of Barnabas denies that Jesus was crucified. So the Gospel of Barnabas has some very favorable pictures. It paints a very favorable picture of Jesus according to Islamic theology. And that's why Muslims want to include it in the New Testament canon. But is the Gospel of Barnabas a first century authentic gospel? Was it around during the time of the first century and intentionally rejected by the early church fathers as they were putting together the canon of the Bible? Is it a legitimate gospel? Well, to answer that, we don't need to look very far. Scholars have taken a critical look at the Gospel of Barnabas. They come up with many, many problematic areas within the Gospel of Barnabas, about 40 different areas. I don't have time today to go over all 40 of the errors. I want to just point out a few of them to demonstrate to you that the Gospel of Barnabas is not an authentic first century gospel as Muslims want to claim it to be, but it was in fact a much, much later fabrication. How do we know this? Well, very simply, up here on the screen you'll see. First of all, look at the word that's up on the screen. The Gospel of Barnabas confuses, whoever the author of the Gospel of Barnabas was, confuses two significant words that were used interchangeably, one in Greek and one in Hebrew. The Greek word Christos, you'll see up on the slide, Christos, was used interchangeably with Mashiach, about Jesus. To say Jesus was the Christos, to say Jesus was the Christ was the same thing as to say that Jesus was the Messiah. Christos and Mashiach, the Hebrew word and the Greek word were used interchangeably with one another. They were used almost like we would use, I don't know, Kleenex and tissue together. To say the Kleenex and tissue, I mean, we're saying the same thing. We're talking about the same thing. Well, the Christos and Mashiach would be to say the same word. They were used interchangeably. This was a very common usage. But yet when we read the Gospel of Barnabas, we find something quite different. The Gospel of Barnabas opens with this. It says, the Gospel of Barnabas, the true gospel of Jesus called Christ, a new prophet sent by God to the world, according to the description of Barnabas, his apostle. So the Gospel of Barnabas opens with Jesus being called the Christ. But yet further on in the Gospel of Barnabas in chapter 42, Jesus confessed and said the truth, I am not the Messiah. After me shall come the Messiah. And it's talking about Muhammad. Jesus claims, according to the Gospel of Barnabas, to be the Christ, but later on he says, I am not the Messiah. This is an error that a first century author would not have made because, again, the Christos and Mashiach, Christ and Messiah, were used as interchangeable words. But the Gospel of Barnabas has Jesus saying, I'm Christ, but I'm not the Messiah. That's a contradiction. This is something that a first century author, an error that a first century author would not have committed. Further on in the Gospel of Barnabas, we're told We're told that Judea Herod and Pilate both ruled in Judea at the time of Jesus' birth. Judea Herod the Great. Herod the Great, according to the Gospel of Barnabas, Herod the Great and Pilate were co-rulers with one another. In chapter 3, we find the following words in the Gospel of Barnabas. There reigned at that time in Judea Herod by decree of Caesar Augustus, and Pilate was the governor. This is a historical anachronism. This is historically wrong, because Herod the Great, ruled from about 37 to 4 BC. Herod the Great died in 4 BC. In fact, Herod the Great was the guy who was alive at the time of Jesus. He's the one that, when the wise men came to him, you remember the story? The wise men came to Herod and said, we've seen the star in the east, and we've come to find who the star in the east represents. We've heard he's called King of the Jews. And Herod tells the wise men, go find who this King of the Jews is and come back to report to me. And remember, Herod ordered the extermination of all Jewish boys 2 years and younger. Herod the Great died in 4 BC. Yet Pilate didn't rule until about 36 AD. He ruled from 26 to 36 AD. So how in the world can the Gospel of Barnabas say Herod the Great and Pilate were co-regents when Herod died in 4 BC, but Pilate didn't start ruling until 26 AD, 30 years later? This is a historical problem that the author of the Gospel of Barnabas makes. Again, another error, a geographical error. In chapter 20 and 21 of the Gospel of Barnabas, we find this geographical error. It says, Jesus went to the Sea of Galilee, and having embarked in a ship, sailed to his city of Nazareth. And having arrived at the city of Nazareth, the seamen that were with him spread through all the city all the deeds that Jesus had done, and then Jesus went up to Capernaum. Now check this out. Look at this map. Look at the map up on the screen. What the Gospel of Barnabas is suggesting, look at the map. See the Sea of Galilee? The Gospel of Barnabas is suggesting that Jesus got into a boat on the opposite side of the Sea of Galilee, sailed to Nazareth. See Nazareth? Sailed to Nazareth. From there, got out of his boat, and then walked up to Capernaum. Do you see a problem? Where's Nazareth? Is Nazareth on the shoreline of the Sea of Galilee? No, it's about 14 kilometers inland. So how in the world could Jesus have gotten into a boat on the Sea of Galilee, sailed to Nazareth, docked his boat in Nazareth, and then walked up to Capernaum? Where's Capernaum? For those of you who've been to Israel, where's Capernaum? It's on the north shore of the Sea of Galilee, right? So it seems like the author of the Gospel of Barnabas got Nazareth and Capernaum geographically confused with one another. Jesus could have sailed on the Sea of Galilee, docked his boat at Capernaum, and then walked up to Nazareth. That would make geographical sense. But for the author of the Gospel of Barnabas to say that Jesus sailed in his boat to Nazareth, that's just absurdity. That's completely absurd. There's no way that a first century author would have made this kind of geographical mistake. Certainly the author of the first century would have known his geography, would have known that area of the Sea of Galilee where Jesus spent the majority of his ministry. If this was written by an authentic author, an authentic apostle of Jesus, who spent much of his ministry time in the Galilee region, such an author, such an apostle, such a close associate of Jesus would not have made this simple geographical error. This is much, much too absurd. The Year of Jubilee, another historical error. The author of the Gospel of Barnabas makes this huge historical error. In chapter 82, we find the following. Insomuch that the year of Jubilee, which now comes every 100 years, shall by Messiah be reduced to every year in every place. So the author of the Gospel of Barnabas in chapter 82 says the year of Jubilee occurs every 100 years. Now from our Bible, how often was the year of Jubilee celebrated? Do you remember? Back in Leviticus chapter 17, or actually, no, Leviticus 29, excuse me. Leviticus 29, consecrate the 50th year and proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you. Each one of you shall return to his family property and each to his own clan. The 50th year shall be a jubilee for you. Leviticus chapter 25, verses 10 and 11. So throughout history, from the early days of the law, chapter 25 in Leviticus, the year of Jubilee was celebrated every 50 years. Every 50 years would be Jubilee. But the author of the Gospel of Barnabas says the Jubilee is celebrated every 100 years, not every 50 years. When in the world did the year of Jubilee be changed to every 100 years? When did it become changed? Do we know? Yeah, we know. We can look back in history. This was changed to a 100-year period in the year 1300 by Pope Boniface VIII. In 1300 AD, Pope Boniface VIII falsely proclaimed that the Jubilee year shall be celebrated by Christians every 100 years instead of every 50 years. The next Pope, Clement VI, after him, changed it back to every 50 years, and so it was celebrated in 1350 AD as a year of Jubilee. So somewhere between 1300 and 1350, the year of Jubilee was celebrated every 100 years. Back in 1350, it was changed back to be celebrated every 50 years. So now we can date the Gospel of Barnabas by this particular observation. Since the author of the Gospel of Barnabas claims that the year of Jubilee was celebrated every 100 years rather than every 50 years, there has only been one point in history where the year of Jubilee was proclaimed to be on a 100-year cycle, and that was between 1300 and 1350. So now we know that the author of the Gospel of Barnabas must have written this particular work sometime within that 50-year period. No wonder the early church fathers didn't include it in the early New Testament canon, because it wasn't around. No wonder the author of the Gospel of Barnabas made such historical mistakes, made grammatical mistakes such as confusing Mashiach and Christos, Messiah and Christ. No wonder the author of the Gospel of Barnabas made a geographical mistake and thought that Nazareth was on the seashore of the Sea of Galilee and Capernaum was inland, because the author of the Gospel of Barnabas was not an authentic first century author. He was a 14th century. This is a 14th century fabrication by a Muslim author who presents a very pro-Islamic, favorable Islamic view of who Jesus was, and tries to redact it, tries to push it back as an authentic first century gospel. And it must be rejected as a first century gospel because it is nothing more than a 14th century fabrication. So don't let Muslims get away with that, but this is a very common argument you will face today. Very quickly,